Hey everybody, thank you for joining me on this episode of Unwritten Chapters. I'm Matthew Heneghan. I have a question for you before we get going. Are you going to war? Are you going to be joining the Canadian Armed Forces voluntarily or otherwise? Well, you might be. Welcome to Unwritten Chapters, a place where I talk about life after trauma. Because life after trauma is possible. Look, I've been a paramedic. I'm a veteran. I've been through and seen my fair share of things, and I bet that you have too. So if you're looking for a place to unwind and a place to potentially write your next chapter, well then at this cozy corner of the internet, you have found it. This is Unwritten Chapters. Let's write the next one together. Thanks for joining me in another episode of Unwritten Chapters, the podcast. I apologize that my intro was a little hyperbolic. And it was indeed hyperbolic because, no, you're not going to be forced to join the military. Is that a possibility? Sure. Probability? No. There's a guy that does a great podcast on this, actually. I'll tell you who he is here in a second. Let me look him up here. Where do I go looking for this? Bill Kelly. Bill Kelly, he's a former broadcaster, mostly out in the Toronto area, but he's got a great podcast where he breaks a lot of this down. But I think that I wanted to supplement that or complement that because, as many of you know, I served in the Canadian Armed Forces. I was in the Armed Forces from 2002 to mid-2008, so 6.5 years of serving during wartime. Very, very busy. Operational tempo was high, rhetoric was real, and there was a lot of consequences of our service during that time. We lost many members of the Canadian Armed Forces, including 3 from my unit alone. And I feel that gives me a unique perspective on speaking about stuff like this, because whether the media means to or not, it can lead to a lot of irrational fears. It can lead to a lot of inconsistent reporting and things that don't actually align to military rhetoric. And the military can be partly to blame for this too, because we have our own lingo. We have our own ways of understanding things and our own ways of speaking, and it doesn't always translate well to civilian transcription. So I wanted to talk about this in terms of its probability and what the plan is actually aimed at doing. So this article here from the Buffalo Toronto Public Media, written by Dan Karpanchuk. I hope I said that correctly. Thanks, Dan, for letting me use your article here to talk to my viewers. So it says, Canada ponders creating a civil force to boost its national defense preparedness. And the beginning part of the article says, some of Canada's top military strategists are working on a plan to boost the country's armed forces. At the center of the plan is the creation of a civil defense force made up of as many as 300,000 volunteers. The 9-page document, Planning Direction, Defense Mobilization Plan, was distributed by Strategic Joint Staff, which is an internal group that offers advice and analysis to the Chief of Defense Staff. The opening line of the document detailing the plan warn of the rising technologies, or that rising technologies have presented an unparalleled challenge to Canada's ability to defend itself. The group is calling for a whole-of-society approach to defend Canada against domestic threats, from natural disasters to high-scale, to high-intensity, large-scale combat operations. That right there can sound a little scary, but is it as scary as it is intended? Not really. Listen, when they're writing these things out, they have to write for worst case scenario. They have to plan for worst case scenario. That's essentially the military MO, right? Hope for the best, plan for the worst. And so they have to write these things in because we do live in a really precarious world right now. The war that's going on in Europe, raging in Ukraine, it may seem like a largely European conflict, especially if you listen to the rhetoric of Mr. Donald Trump down south. But if you open a history book, you'll understand that that's not really the case. The writing was on the wall for a conflict like this to emerge in Europe, and it has emerged. European conflict historically has led to North American conflict. Maybe not directly on our soil, Thank God, because nobody wants that. We don't want that. But I mean, Canada specifically, it's so closely connected geographically to Russia that things could always escalate, things could always move and perpetuate further conflict. And so we do need to take this seriously. We do need to take the thought of conflict seriously. It doesn't mean that Canada is going to be going door to door and taking people from the ages of 18 to 25 or 35 or whatever and just conscript them into military service. Canada has a lot more, sorry, I almost dropped my phone. Canada has a lot more things to go about prior to implementing something like that. There's a lot of red tape they'd have to go through before implementing stuff like that. And this isn't designed to evoke fear. I'm going to be talking about this in a two-pronged approach because Canada has largely been a volunteer force for quite some time, especially post the Korean conflict. And I feel you would have a larger volunteer force if you didn't try to erode pride, national pride from within. And we'll get to that. I'll talk about that, and I'll talk about the challenges that modern narratives are presenting to retention and to getting active recruitment. It's hard to ask for national volunteers if you promote and promulgate a myth and a narrative driven that you know we're bad from birth because of colonialism and that we're inherently bad and wicked because of that. And we do that. We perpetuate that. We really do. And I'll get into that. But to go back to the article and read a little bit more about it, when it talks about the large-scale combat operations, this is just language used because the plan is to plan for the worst. It goes on to say, we're thinking about the number of events and domestic operations we've had in terms of fighting forest fires and so on. And so this is all part of our transformation effort, said General Carignan, the Chief of Defense Staff. All Canadians will be, of course, voluntarily invited to serve. That's a very important caveat there. Voluntarily invited. They're really going to kind of promote and push things in a primarily voluntary role. This is not a done deal yet, as the article says. It's not a done deal yet. The strategy must still be approved by the federal government in Ottawa, but Minister of National Defense David McGuinty is behind it, which is an important step to have this approval. The notion of having a civil force or civil group of Canadians who are ready, willing, and able to serve their country is something that has been talked about for years in Canada, he said. And he, I believe, is McGuinty. It is something that our allies are doing and pursuing very, very actively. And he's not wrong about that. A lot of European countries have upped their commitment to military service, and they've asked for other civil workers to supplement the military role. Obviously, Ukraine is a very specific and unique case where they have just been, you hear stories where they take people off the streets and things, but that's a very dire case, and I don't see Canada falling into that. However, Canada does need to take defense seriously. We've relied on the United States for generalized protection for a number of years, and it was something that was agreed upon from previous governments, like well predating Trump, well predating Carney and other iterations of our government, that we would allow the U.S. to kind of be the primarily defense/offense military machine to our southern border, and we would not be sort of a large force above. Times change, things change, allyship changes, and the U.S. is becoming very, very, I would say, myopic, thinking just in terms of themselves. Which, I mean, if you again look back at history and you look at the European conflicts, World Wars I and II, it took the U.S. a hefty kick in the nuts to get involved in World War I. With the sinking of Lithuania, they kept saying it's a European conflict. It's a European conflict. Turns out, nope, not so much a European conflict, right? Your World War II, again, it's a European thing. It's a European issue. It's a European conflict, so on and so forth. And then Japan had no choice. They felt like they had no choice but to get involved and strike the U.S. due to a lot of sanctions and hardship that was being levied onto Japan at the time. And so guess what? It wasn't a European conflict anymore. So I feel like, to strictly think of this in terms of European only, it's a really myopic way to look at things. And and the way Trump has been going about it by alienating his allies, not the greatest way to go about things. America has a very American first mentality based on votership for Donald Trump. Fair enough, so be it. That is what it is. But these things are very real that Canada needs to start kind of shifting away from the belief that the U.S. is just going to be the main protector of our borders and our sovereignty. That is something that we should always be able to do on our own. And we do have, a force within the Canadian Armed Forces. They are very highly trained, very highly motivated, very competent, and the training is amazing. It's second to none. However, the fighting force itself is diminutive in terms of what we could do in a defensive scale. Canada is naturally protected by geography, so there is that. I'm not saying that we're going to be invaded, and that's why we need a defensive force, but we need a defensive force on the grand scale of world happenings. Canada's strategy calls for supplementary force that would initially prioritize volunteer public servants at the federal and provincial levels. Again, volunteer. You're going to see this word come up quite a bit. It's no surprise that the Department of National Defense and the Canadian Armed Forces would look to many sources to recruit people from, including people who are already dedicated to public service, McGinty said. There may be federal, there may be provincial, there may be municipal, they may be in business. Right, meaning that there's people from all walks of life. In the reserve force that we currently have. So if I look up here, primary reserve force, we have approximately right now. What do we got here? I wrote this down. Okay, so according to the Office of the Auditor General of Canada, we currently have a reserve force of anywhere between 19,000 to 23,561. And they want us to have upwards of 30,000. So we're roughly 6,000 something short there. 6,439 people short in the primary reserve role. But our primary reserve role is sort of like your United States National Guard in a sense. I think the primary reserve guys have to give up one weekend a month to donate to training and to operations. I believe that's how it goes. If you're in the primary reserve, please correct me. Let me know if I'm getting it wrong. The supplementary reserve and primary reserve are two very different things. Supplementary reserve, obviously, is to supplement the primary reserve and to supplement the Canadian Forces as a greater whole. The supplementary reserve, so case in point, when I got out of the military, they had asked me, do you want to be placed on the supplementary reserve list in case there is ever a need for active recall? And I said, absolutely. So my name is on the supplementary reserve list. I'm part of that supplementary reserve. Supplementary reserve doesn't mean that I have to do anything in the day-to-day. I don't do anything military related. I don't do any military training. I don't have to submit my name anywhere. I don't have to talk to people. I don't have to do anything. I just have to realize that my name is on the list, and therefore I could be recalled if something catastrophic really were to occur and our current strength of forces were not enough to handle that. So they're looking at building the primary reserve and the supplementary reserve. So it actually goes on here to talk about some of the numbers. It says, Canada's armed forces have been struggling to recruit and retain people. It's still short by about 15,000 for an authorized strength of 71,000 soldiers and 30,000 reservists. And there are issues with attrition and retention in the Canadian Armed Forces. Attrition and retention. Well, that doesn't shock me because there are bases around Canada right now that don't have access to clean drinking water. Bases out east that don't have that housing is upwards of 70 years old, and the infrastructure for housing our soldiers is crumbling. So you have young guys that want to get in the military and serve and be a part of it, and they do for the most part. They join and they become part of the armed forces, but then there's nowhere for them to stay. right? And then if they meet somebody, if they do get into the armed force and they do stay and they meet somebody who they want to get married or live with, there's nowhere for them to live because they're living in squalor. They're living in places where literally code is not up to snuff, and they're living in, their quarters are not conducive with retention. And so that's one aspect right there. Two is pay disparity in between cost of living and what they were making was low. The military or the government has aimed to correct that by giving a boost to payment of its troops and of its soldiers. And so you might see a bit more of a recruitment bump there, but you still have to incentivize retention, right? You have to make it worthwhile to stay in. The military is a very unique life. It's a very tough life. You're away a lot. You give up a lot. A lot of your rights and freedoms go away in terms of the greater good. It's a tough thing. It's not an easy way of life that's designed for everybody. So retention is always going to be something that you have to pay special attention to, and you have to come up with unique incentives to keep people in the military. One of the biggest things right now that I kind of alluded to before is this belief that we've allowed promulgated both in our national media and from our institutions that Canada is inherently bad. The RCMP at one point, actually I think, here, let me see if I can, RCMP, inherently racist. Yep, public safety, systemic RCMP. So there's a lot of articles here. But the RCMP have officially acknowledged that systemic racism exists within the organization, which impacts both its employees and the communities it serves, particularly against Indigenous peoples. I don't know if I can get the member who actually said this. But here's, I think this might be from the RCMP themselves. Let's see if that will populate. Royal Canadian Mounted Police, yeah. We acknowledge that systemic racism exists within the RCMP, which impacts our employees as well as diverse communities we serve. This is why we're making fundamental changes to how we work, built on inclusivity and respect. I don't know. It was like the head of the RCMP that came out and said this. Here's the thing. The lady that came out and said this was during Trudeau's era, but she came out and said this with no proof. With no proof. When she was countered, when there was opposition, and said, "Hey, okay, so what do you mean by systemic racism?" She had zero examples. She had nothing to cite. She had nothing concrete to solidify what she was saying. So she was just regurgitating political slander toward RCMP, and the RCMP is heavily linked to Canadian Armed Forces. In fact, they both fit under the Veterans Affairs umbrella when it comes to care for their well-being. And so you have that. You also have stuff like this, where cities like Toronto raise the Palestinian flag at City Hall, joining other cities across Canada, because there's this big inherent promulgation that what Israel is doing is wrong. It's terrible. It's just not good. They never raised the Israeli flag after October 7th. And October 7th was abhorrent. Thousands of people died. Thousands of people died because a group crossed the border illegally and killed people with guns. In Australia, just a couple days ago, there was another attack aimed at the Jewish people. You got to understand that the people that you're trying to recruit for civil and / military service are people with really strong moral compasses. People that see things and understand things that are right and wrong. You don't have to wholly believe that Israel is doing the right thing. Conflict is terrible. Conflict is messy. It's gross. If you go, I wouldn't recommend you do it, but if you go and you look online about the conflict in Ukraine, you're going to see a lot of combat footage, worn on helmets, drone footage, etc. And you're going to see that what Ukrainian soldiers are engaged in is barbaric. I'm not calling the soldiers barbaric. What they're engaged in is barbaric, because that is warfare. That's the reality of warfare. There's a video right now that Russia is using as promotional footage shows a Russian soldier engaging in hand-to-hand combat with a Ukrainian soldier, and he kills him with a knife. And it's brutal. It's absolutely disgustingly brutal. There's another footage out there that's not really being used by Ukrainians, but it's out there. And it shows two soldiers, if not more, underneath a tank in the middle of a field, and a drone was dropping grenades trying to eliminate the threat. And those weren't working, so they had to send actual troops up. And the troops came up, and they were engaging, and they threw a grenade underneath the tank. There was nowhere for the Russians to go at that point. And so you see you see the actual grenade hit the Russian soldier, and he just cuddles it, knowing full well this is it. And it goes off, and you see a helmet fly out from underneath the tank, and then the soldier goes through and continues to lay fire underneath where the threat was to truly eliminate whatever threat may or may not remain. Brutal. Absolutely barbaric to watch. That's warfare. But the media and a lot of super left-leaning people are pushing this narrative that Palestine is somehow a victim and altruistic, and they're just being wiped out by Israeli forces. And so now you have places like City Hall in Toronto raising the Palestinian flag on Canadian soil. Another incident that occurred with this was there was a Canadian who played the Canadian national anthem on a jukebox, and a police officer went over and shut it off. The thing is, it wasn't loud enough to be criminal mischief. And so I know what the cop was trying to do. The cop was just trying to mitigate conflict. He's trying to mitigate any sort of violence that could come back from that. Here's the big issue with that, though. The violence isn't being perpetrated by those who are just playing the Canadian national anthem. It just isn't. It just isn't. The violence is coming from a very specific sect of people, and it's not a guy that's playing. Vituperation comes from that guy, the guy who plays the jukebox. He's angry. I'm angry. I don't think that we should be flying the Palestinian flag above our government institutions. What purpose does that serve? You can acknowledge that what's happening in Gaza and to the people of Gaza is really tragic and sad, while supporting Israeli mission to defend itself. Those two things can inherently exist at the same time. There's no reason to throw a Palestinian flag up when the country of Palestine is beleaguered by terrorism. It sends a very poor message to the international community, and it sends a very poor message to those who you're trying to recruit to serve in the Canadian Armed Forces, because effectively, I know this is municipal, but effectively what you're doing is you're trying to ask them to potentially support the mission of Palestinian people, of terrorists, known terrorist groups, and give their lives to do so. Now, that may sound hyperbolic. This is the imagery. This is what you're sending to people when you do stuff like this, when you allow stuff like this, when you push stuff like this. Because I think everyone, the middle-of-the-road person, could agree that Israel has a right to defend itself. Israel as a nation has a right to defend itself. We can all look at what happened on October 7th and go, that was really terrible. And most people do. But now we have this whole narrative here where, well, yeah, you wouldn't know what happened. We're just not even going to talk about it. We're just going to say that what Israel is doing is wrong and reprehensible. Oh, by the way, please join our military because these are our belief systems, and we might send you to go and back up our narratives. You're not going to have a whole lot of luck getting people, middle-of-the-road people, to join your system that way. You just won't. Saying things like RCMP are inherently racist and raising Palestinian flags, not the way to go about it. Not a good look. Not a good look to try and get empathy and support on your side to build a military around. When people talk about national pride, they call it supremacy. They call it colonialism. They call it white supremacy. They call it neo-nationalism. Having pride in Canada. Canada Day, you see a lot of people running around now with signs that read, "No pride in genocide," because we have institutions like United Nations exclaiming that what Canada perpetrated through the years of the residential school system or the implementation of the residential school system is genocide. And then you have government wings echoing that sentiment. But then there's no mass graves, there's no bodies presented, there's nothing but anecdotal presentations, and those anecdotals have been, some of those anecdotals have been proven completely false and fake news. But nothing really gets done about that. So you're kind of going uphill when you don't have to. You're trying to recruit for Canada to be a defense force and to have some self-reliance. But you're telling them that all the institutions are terrible. The RCMP, inherently racist. Canadian government, inherently racist. They're colonial. They're propping colonial assets. There's a case right now in Nova Scotia where a band chief has banned the premier from all of their band land because he was saying you can't sell illegal quantities and amounts and micrograms of cannabis from your reserve. And so he was implementing RCMP to enforce that, and they called that enforcement of colonial practice. So they don't have to adhere to our laws, but when you try to make them adhere to our laws, because they are Canadian, whether they want to admit it or not, they're Canadian, they're on Canadian soil, it's Canadian soil, it's not your soil, it's Canadian soil. Well, that's colonialism. And colonialism is inherently bad when it comes with a Judeo-Christian, Eurasian mindset, when it comes in that relative recent history, right? Even though every group has colonized at some point and been colonized at some point, you're not going to get a lot of success with recruitment that way. And you're not going to get a lot of success with retention from the people that you do recruit. You're not going to get a lot of success with retaining them when you allow the narratives to be pushed that what they're doing is inherently bad, that they're on stolen land. Land acknowledgements saying that you're on stolen land, that what you've done is inherently bad simply by being born here. It's not your land, so why would you defend it? It's not your land, so why would you sacrifice for it? It's not your land, so why would you give a shit if it needs defending or not? These things are all counterproductive. They're all counterintuitive. We can have conversations, real conversations about the atrocities that befell the Indigenous communities. Absolutely. Those things can exist, as can Canada. Canada's existed for over 150 years. Everybody alive today, Canada's existed for longer than us. So for these Indigenous bands to now start coming back and, filing claims and saying that, your laws don't apply to us, that's not reconciliatory. That's not reconciliatory. Sorry, to use the word correctly. Reconciliation has an end game. It has a desired end game. So far, there has been no end game mentioned. There has been no finish line mentioned. There has been no overall goal mentioned. And what we're witnessing is not reconciliation, but retribution. I believe personally that a lot of our issues today would be resolved by simply embracing Canada as a whole. We are Canadian. Period. Dot. Ending. We're Canadian. You can be Indigenous and have Indigenous practices and have pride in being Indigenous, the same as you can have pride in being Irish and pride in being Ugandan and pride in being Punjab, etc., 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 etc. But if you have a Canadian passport and you move to Canada for the purpose of becoming Canadian, you are Canadian. That's it. Period. Dot. Ending. You're not special because your land was taken. Every land has been taken. And you took land. Indigenous people took land. Indigenous people took land from other people and enslaved other people. In fact, there were more Indigenous slavery or slaves from Indigenous peoples than there were during the transatlantic slave trade within Canada. The historical fact. There's inconvenient, but historically accurate. Our history of slavery gets conflated a lot with the United States, and it just simply is not the same thing. All forms of slavery are abhorrent, by the way. Terrible, abhorrent, should be abolished. Just figured I'd get that on record right now because this is the internet, and you just never know. what people say. You're not going to recruit people effectively with that line of messaging, and then having messages where you're like, hey, we need people in our armed forces. As the demands on our Canadian Armed Forces have increased, their resources and their salaries have not kept pace, said Mark Carney. And these are the men and women we trust to wear the maple leaf, the Canadian flag, and risk their lives for it. Their pay should reflect the weight of those responsibilities. Well, so should government rhetoric, because you're the ones sending us, Canadian Armed Forces, to potentially give their lives. 159 Canadians gave their lives in Afghanistan. You first sent us over there with green uniforms to a desert because we were not ready for it. And now you're telling us that our systems are inherently bad, they're inherently racist, they're inherently misogynist or systemically oppressive. Please join them. Please join them. Please join us. Join the ranks. We need you. We need you. You say the maple leaf and the Canadian flag as though there should be some pride behind it. And then in city halls and institutions, you allow the raising of other flags that have absolutely nothing to do with Canadian values. Your messaging does not align. Your words don't match what you're wanting. So who are you trying to recruit? And if you fail to recruit, does that mean you're now going to have to force civil service? Because I think if you do, you're going to have a lot of angry people on your hands, a lot of protests on your hands. Much more than you have if you just start talking realistically without pushed narratives. That's the way you recruit, is getting back to understanding that no, Canada is not inherently racist. No, Canada is not inherently bad. Canada makes the most concessions out of any other country for their Indigenous people. Give me another example of another country, another civilized country that makes as many concessions as we do, that creates things like the Truth and Reconciliation Board. Show me the other countries that do it to the scale, the capacity that we do. You'll be hard pressed. You'll be hard pressed. That is not indicative of systemic racism. It is, however, indicative of a country that lost its way. It may have started out as a great idea, may have started out with great intent, but many things that start out with great intent go off the rails and go in a completely wrong direction. And I feel like we're going in the wrong direction. I feel like we're living in a time where we need people. We need people to join. We need people to serve. We need people to do so with pride. And we need our government to take care of them. The government is spending money on the Canadian Armed Forces. That's awesome. The government is stripping money away from Veterans Affairs, the very system that is designed to care for these soldiers when they are injured in service or when their service is finished. So again, those two things don't align. And why would you have service retention if they know that they could potentially be injured and then face a lot of struggle trying to receive benefits, trying to receive care post-service? Why would you have retention there? You won't. Period. Dot. Ending. You won't. So, my question stands. Are you going to serve? Let me know in the comments. This has been Unwritten Chapters. I'm Matthew Heneghan. I will see you in the next episode. Until then, be well, be safe, and above all else, keep talking to each other. Welcome to Unwritten Chapters, a place where I talk about life after trauma. Because yeah, life after trauma is possible. Look, I've been a paramedic. I'm a veteran. I've been through and seen my fair share of things, and I bet that you have too. So if you're looking for a place to unwind and a place to potentially write your next chapter, well then at this cozy corner of the internet, you have found it. This is Unwritten Chapters. Let's write the next one together.